My name is Rabbi Ryan Daniels. I am really excited to introduce you, really grateful to my friend David Goldenberg, the Regional Director of ADL Midwest. David brings incredible wisdom, incredible experience, and he is literally talking, eating, breathing, and doing this work each day, all day long.
A little bit about ADL. ADL was founded in 1913, actually here in Chicago, with a dual-pronged mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. And we take both parts of that mission very seriously. And our feeling is that you can't fight one form of hate really without fighting all forms of hate. And I think we're seeing that a lot. And so if we look at the work that we do and what we fight, we really fight kind of four big areas. Number one, we fight anti-Semitism. Number two, we fight bias, bigotry, and discrimination. Number three, we fight extremism. And number four, we fight cyber hate. And we do it through, I would say, three sort of pillars. The first is through investigations and research, investigations into extremists. ADL's Center on Extremism is the leading tracker and monitor of extremists and extremist networks in the country. We monitor, we track, we ultimately try to thwart extremists from doing bad things and provide law enforcement with tips to help them do their investigation. And then we do research into extremism, into anti-Semitism, historical and contemporary, and kind of across the gamut into different forms of hate and discrimination. We also do it through education and training. ADL's No Place for Hate program is among the leading anti-bias training programs for K through 12 schools. And I'm proud, and we can talk about this later, but I'll take a moment to plug it for any of you who are educators or have kids or grandkids. No Place for Hate is a culture changing program in schools, and we're actually now offering it for free for K through 12 schools. And so that is something that we're trying to get into more and more schools on the North Shore and throughout the region as well. But we also do it through training. Oh, clearly I didn't turn everything off. I apologize. One moment. I'm sorry. My children have things all over the house, and so I'm so sorry about that. So in training, we have K through 12 programming for kids and for educators. We also have anti-bias training programs for college-age students and faculty, and we also have it for law enforcement. ADL, believe it or not, is we are the largest non-governmental trainer of law enforcement in the country. For those up here in the North Shore, we've done anti-bias and managing implicit bias training for Island Park, for Evanston, for Skokie, for Glenview, for Waukegan police departments. And we've also just finished training the entire Chicago Police Department, all 13,000 or so of them. And lastly, we do our work through advocacy and assist. Advocacy in working with other civil rights partners, advocacy through legislative advocacy, as you can think of, and assist through helping people respond to hate-based and bias-based incidents. So to give you a sense, ADL, our office alone, responded to more than 550 incidents last year. And that was 120 more than the year before. And that was 70 more than the year before. So it tells you sort of the environment that we're all kind of living in. So what I thought that would be helpful before moving on is to create a baseline understanding of a definition from anti-Semitism. And this is the only slide that I'm actually going to read verbatim. So this is the definition that we use when we talk about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. It's important to note, especially given everything that we've got going on, we don't classify and categorize all critiques of Israel as anti-Semitic, but we do have definitions as to when it crosses the line. So when we look at common tropes and stereotypes, these are historical tropes and stereotypes of Jews. Things that Jews are cheap and greedy, Jews are responsible for the deicide. dual loyalty. That is, they're more loyal to Israel than they are to their home country, not just the United States, but others. Jews have too much power and control, the blood libel. And so when we start looking at it, and this is what I wanted to take a moment here, is that what we're seeing with regards to anti-Semitism today versus in the past and these different tropes is we've seen sort of the reemergence of these tropes. And what I did here was I pulled old images from anywhere from the 1700s to the 1940s, which you can see here on the left, the idea of Jewish bankers. And here on the right-hand side, that was taken during COVID on a right-wing extremist chat room that eventually made it to Twitter. That is, Jews were ultimately profiting off of COVID. Again, here, showing that the revenge against Jews for the death of Jesus from, as you can see here, in the 13th century. And then here on the right-hand side, outside of Yeshiva University in New York in 2017, the Jews killed Jesus. Again, these tropes appear. We have the picture here of dual loyalty from an Austrian postcard prior to the war, World War II. And then again, here on the right-hand side, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib suggesting that there's dual loyalty again. Donald Trump saying that Jewish people who vote for Democrats are very disloyal to Israel. So again, these types of instances and charges of dual loyalty. Jews having too much power and control, this taken from the late 1800s, the idea of the caricature of Rothschild holding the world in his hands. And again, fast forward to now more than 100 and almost 120 years later, on the right-hand side, Rothschild again controlling Soros, who's controlling the military. And so again, this is plays into it. Responsible for the blood libel, you see the graphic from the late 1400s. Again, on the right-hand side, from 2014 in Miami, Florida, the real vampire is Israel. And these are just examples, because the unfortunate thing is I can pull many, many of these from different protests. So when we talk about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric, what we see here is we look at sort of what many of you may know is Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, the idea of the charges of dual, when anti-Israel, a reasonable critique of Israel, of their policies, of the government of Israel, of different policies, when it crosses the line into anti-Semitism, when there are charges of dual loyalty, when there's the establishment of double standards, that is, Israel is expected to behave different than other countries. So we're seeing that right now, the idea that other countries have the right to defend themselves from terrorist attacks, and that Israel all of a sudden doesn't have that right. We believe that crosses the line. And then ultimately demagoguing Israel and their actions. And so, what I pulled here, these were just a couple images. ADL put out a new report today about the anti-Semitism that we're seeing on social media as it relates to the current crisis in Israel. This is one that plays into the QAnon conspiracies that if you remember QAnon, for those of you who are familiar with it, that the notion is that the country is run by a cabal of pedophiles, and Donald Trump was elected to root them out. Ultimately here, that it fed into the notion and anti-Semitic trope of Jewish power. And in this particular case, again, you can see this image. This was taken off of Instagram earlier this morning. So we're not talking about some extreme website. This was taken off of Instagram. This image right here on the right-hand side was taken on Sunday by a security camera at Persian Hebrew Congregation, which is in Skokie. The synagogue was vandalized, its window was broken, and this particular individual hung up a sign that said freedom for Palestine or something along those lines, and police are investigating this as a hate crime. So we're seeing this play out in a lot of different ways. Many of you, and I'm happy to talk about this, many of you have probably heard about different Facebook groups in the last couple of days here in and around Chicago that have gotten a lot of tension. So let's take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about anti-Semitic attitudes. And Susan, I've got your question and I will come back to it at the very end if that's okay. I've got it written down. I haven't forgotten about it. I've got it in my parking lot. So ADL since the 1960s has been conducting what we call our Global 100 survey. We have surveyed 100 countries, and we've been tracking anti-Semitic attitudes in these countries for basically the better part of the last 40, 50 years. Now, you can't call someone up and say, hey, are you an anti-Semite? Are you anti-Semitic? And they say, oh, yes or no, for anybody who's ever been called for a poll. Instead, we ask 11 questions that plays off of the tropes and the stereotypes that I just explained. And we seek their what their answers are. If they say yes, likely yes, then we count that as a yes. And if they say yes or likely yes, or probably for 6 of the 11, we count them as categorize them as having a propensity, anti-Semitic propensities. So what I thought would be kind of interesting, especially right now as we're dealing with these different incidents and what's going on with Israel, is to show you the history of our results. Now, you can see back in the 1960s, in the heart of the civil rights movement, nearly a third of all Americans answered yes to 6 of those 11 questions that played off of those tropes. You then see it declining. It was pretty high in 1992. At the time, the economy was not doing particularly well, which is not uncommon where we see little bumps. But generally speaking, with the exception of 2022, you pretty much see anti-Semitic attitudes staying about the same, all things considered, for the last 20 years. And in fact, in 2019, down to 11%. Yet what I'm going to show you in a couple minutes is going to be the number of incidents that we've been tracking. And so it begs the question of, if anti-Semitic attitudes are so low, why are we seeing so many anti-Semitic incidents? So remember this number, remember this percentage, and we're going to come back to it in a couple minutes. So one of the things when we break it down a little bit more into the actual questions is nearly 27% of Americans still think that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. A quarter think that Jews are more loyal to Israel than America. Nearly 20% think that Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. 15% Jews have too much power in the business world, and 11% Jews have too much control over the US government. So if you think about some of these tropes and attitudes and how they pop up, it's concerning. So what I want to put this out here for is, I'd like to ask you to unmute if you'd like, and ask me, looking here at these 6 countries, what do you think would have the highest number or the highest percentage of anti-Semitic attitudes of these 6? Just out of curiosity. I heard what, the UK?
Yeah. Or Iran, one of them. Too.
Or Iran. And feel free to unmute yourself. I see a couple people in chat, so I'm trying to see if anybody wrote UK, somebody wrote Argentina, Poland. So let's kind of switch here and see what the results are. So not surprising. So I would say this in the UK. To be fair, the UK numbers were actually taken in 2015. So before really the rise of the Labour Party in power. Interesting, to 60% in Iran is the lowest of the Middle Eastern and Persian Gulf states that we survey. In Poland, I guess it's not surprising at 45%. But the one thing that I want to kind of point out too, obviously Germany is the lower number at 15%, really, I think, reflective of the education programs that the country has had as it relates to Holocaust education. But the number that really stands out to me is 20% with China. And when you think about how anti-Semitic tropes and it has permeated into different countries, there is barely 2% it's not even 2% of China's population. It's actually like around 1% of China's population that has any affiliation with Judaism. And when you think about it, that there's 20% of their population, when you think about the different stereotypes and how they permeate in different ways and spread, it's just kind of an interesting number. So if we remember that number of anti-Semitic attitudes, of it being at the lowest point it was in 2019, here's the number that you should be concerned about. So these are the number of incidents that ADL has tracked over the last 5 years. You can see in 2020, we had a slight dip from the previous year. However, 2020 still was the third highest total number of anti-Semitic incidents that we have tracked since we began tracking. It's still 59% higher than it was in 2016. And we continue to see really concerning trends. Here in the Midwest, and our Midwest region that we cover includes Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. We did see a slight dip, but we still are 84% higher than we were in 2016. And one of the things that I want to point out here too is that these numbers, if I go back, just a slight dip. If we go back, these numbers are still when most of the country was locked up in their home from March through the end of the year due to COVID. And so these numbers are still that high. If you kind of look at the country as well and the number of incidents, those states that are orange have the highest number of incidents that we tracked in 2020, with New York leading the way, California right behind it. And then we had a significant dip, but you jump down to Florida and Pennsylvania, which saw significant numbers, and Massachusetts as well. And then Illinois finds itself in kind of like the next tier, but we're still in the upper tier of 40 or more incidents. And so that's really concerning, especially when you break it down, when you're talking about nearly one incident that makes our audit every week, pretty much. So we also break it down when we look at our incidents. These are not necessarily clearly defined crimes, but instead they're incidents of harassment, vandalism, and assault. And we learn about these incidents by people who call us and report these incidents. We learn about these incidents through synagogues and temples. We learn about them through the JCRC and others. So you can see that harassment went up a decent amount. We saw vandalism go down and the number of assaults go down ultimately as well. But we're still seeing there's still a significant number that is quite concerning over the last couple of years. So a couple other things that we saw was 40% increase in incidents that were targeting Jewish institutions like synagogues. 9% of incidents involved references to Israel or Zionism, and 16% of incidents were committed or inspired by extremist groups. And I put that number up there because we can say, wow, that's really, wow, 16%. But that also means that 84% of these incidents were not committed or inspired by extremist groups. They were acts of anti-Semitism. They were committed by individuals who took the action on their own, but they weren't card-carrying members of a hate group. And so that ought to be real concerning as we think about these problems. The other piece of it too is that for whatever reason in our region, whereas we see nationally around 19% of all incidents in schools or incidents that we track are in K through 12 schools, 60% of them in our region are in K through 12 schools. We have kids who are experimenting with hate in many, many different ways. And it's really concerning. And these range anywhere from, by the way, graffiti and swastikas to kids in a gym class whose teacher leaves a room for a minute and they think it's a good idea to lay down in the shape of a swastika, and some kid takes a picture and it goes viral on social media. And so we see a lot of these things ranging from TikTok videos that are attacking Jews, jokes about money. We're starting to see that play out again. So we have a problem. And let's talk about a little bit about some other trends that we're seeing. We have seen a dramatic increase in white supremacist propaganda across the country. We saw a significant decline in these incidents that were occurring on college campuses, as you can see, which is the dark blue in that graph. But off campus, we saw a more than doubling in the number of white supremacist propaganda incidents that we saw in last year from the year before. We believe it was directly tied to the election. And many white supremacists who felt empowered. And we're real concerned. We see it a lot in Illinois, significant increase in Illinois. And we think that this genie's out of the bottle and it's going to take a lot to push them back. Here are some examples just to give you a sense of the types of things that we see. So they range anywhere from groups like Patriot Front, which really they take a populist approach. The upper left-hand corner, America First. You see the attacks on the Black community, and the upper one on the second one from the left. You see Reject White Guilt. You see on the bottom, in the lower right-hand corner, which came from a neo-Nazi group, the one Hitler was right. So this kind of gives you a sense of the pardon expression, the crap that we see that's out there, and the hateful messages that white supremacists are trying to push. We also saw anti-Semitism, and I'm going to go through these slides relatively quickly, but You can see these examples of how anti-Semitism reared its ugly face during COVID. You see the upper left-hand corner, which is COVID viewed under a microscope, the face of the wandering Jew. Jews are actually the virus itself. Worse than coronavirus will ever be. Bottom part, David Clark, a known white supremacist, saying that George Soros was responsible. And on the right-hand side, showing that Jews are ultimately, the coronavirus is ultimately a Trojan horse for Jews to take over the world. We also saw anti-Semitism during stay-at-home protests. Many of you saw these play out last spring. The Hitler and Nazi comparisons. The upper left-hand corner is Gavin Newsom in California, governor of California. Lower left-hand corner, again, comparing Governor Whitmer in Michigan to Hitler. Big ones targeting Governor Pritzker in the other three pictures. And then lastly, we also saw Zoom bombing, if you remember, prior to COVID, or to the early stages of COVID, where classes and events and programs were interrupted, often with anti-Semitic and white supremacist threatening messages. And I'm sorry for the language up there. I use it for educational purposes, but I want you can see what we ultimately have been seeing. So let's take a minute and talk about how you can help, and then I'm going to wrap up and I'll come back to Sharon's question to kick off our Q&A. So why is this happening? The first thing that I want to talk about is the political and social environment. We are all aware of the vitriol, the hate, the extremism that we're seeing, that we saw last year, especially over the last few years. And we're also seeing it play out significantly on social media right now during the current crisis in Israel. It is at a level of intensity that we at ADL have not seen before as it relates to previous crises in Israel. We also attribute to what's going on with the rise of the internet and social media. Long gone are those days where you need to find a room in the darkness of the night to connect with an extremist. Instead, you just pick up your phone. In a matter of seconds, you can be exposed to extremist ideologies and extremist messages and symbols. And kids are experimenting more and more. And then lastly, there's basic ignorance. People are not learning more about one another. They stick closer to folks who they're, in their minds, comfortable with. And we ultimately see that play out in a lot of different ways. So ADL encourages people to speak out. That picture on the upper right-hand corner, if you remember, the fall of 2019 was the march in New York City, which ADL was proud to be a partner in that. But we encourage people to speak out, not only against anti-Semitism, but against all forms of hate. The idea of being an upstander and not a bystander is really important in the work that ADL does. We've seen people organizing rallies and supporting other communities. These were in Chicago shortly before COVID. And it's really important that we ultimately all speak out and support other communities. We encourage people to share facts. So we encourage people to utilize our online resources, something to make you all available. We have lesson plans and book lists, anti-bias and bullying strategies available for free on our website. For those of you who have families, we also have what we call table talks, the idea of how do you talk about what's going on in Israel today with your kids. You want to talk to them, but you don't quite know what to say, and you want to make sure you say the right thing. And so these are things that I think are really helpful to families. For me, I have a 10-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old, and we use our table talk, particularly for our 10-year-old, but some elements of it for 4-year-olds. And we find that it makes us even feel more prepared to talk. The other thing too is reporting an incident. When incidents happen, we incur of anti-Semitism, bias, or discrimination. We ask you to report it to ADL. We track these and we ultimately help people. And this is the homepage of our website. So what I want to end before I open it up to Q&A, I know I've thrown a lot at you in about 23 minutes at this point. I want to end with what we call 6 simple strategies. We've all been in situations, and now as the country prepares, knock on wood, and God willing, to reopen in a meaningful way, and we're able to come back together. Inevitably, we've all been in situations where somebody says something that doesn't land quite well, that we feel, that wasn't quite right, but we don't know what to say. So I want to offer these six simple strategies, and then we'll open it up to questions. So imagine, the first strategy that we say is assume good intent and explain the impact someone's comments had on you personally. So for example, somebody says to you, you don't look Jewish. You turn it around and saying, I know you mean well, but that hurts me or can offend others. The idea of saying something like that. And again, you can translate that into the current crisis and the conversations you could be having right now as it relates to Israel, but making it personal. Another strategy, asking somebody a question. When someone says, well, what do you expect from a foreigner? You could turn to that person and say, well, what do you mean by that? Have them unpack it. And you can often find out what is the root of that particular comment, which then helps maybe redirect the conversation or direct it to something a little bit more positive. Number 3, interrupt and redirect. Oh, you got to hear this joke. These 2 Irish guys are sitting in a bar. Whoa, let's not go down that path. And again, you could insert any type of stereotype. Again, a joke that might be reinforcing a stereotype that you don't really want to engage in. Number 4, broadening to universal human behavior. Well, gay men are all drama. I don't know if that's necessarily a gay thing. I think lots of different people have that quality. And so I think the idea, again, of making it's a broader human universal behavior. Another one, make it individual. Religious people are so close-minded. Do you mean everyone who's religious, or are you speaking of someone in particular? And this is, by the way, something that I use quite often whenever someone says, oh, this can't possibly happen because of that, right? So the last one I'll say is say ouch. Those people are all alike. Ouch. Ouch is a word that unless you're 3 years old, you probably don't use in your regular conversations. And so the idea of using the word ouch, it creates a natural pause because it's a word that somebody doesn't hear very often. And so again, it's a way to sort of open it up and create a pause and a moment to address some of those issues.